no one's been paying much attention to Egypt, which is kind of not even been on the radar for most Americans, but that Sisi apparently is in growing risk of potentially facing a popular uprising, revolution, or even the emergence of political activism aimed at internal regime change. What do you think of what's going on in Egypt?
Dan, I'm so glad that you are mentioning Egypt. Egypt is the elephant in the corner. You're talking about a nation of almost 100 million, maybe a little more. It's enormously important to us strategically. It's the linchpin in much of our strategy for North Africa and the Middle East. We've worked tirelessly to keep Sisi in power. Remember, General Sisi took over at a point in time when it looked like the Muslim Brotherhood was going to dominate and run the country. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood across the Middle East reports to Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. And the Egyptians are very sensitive to the Turkish problem. They regard it as a problem. Remember, they were under Turkish rule for many years, under Ottoman rule, and subsequently became independent, only with the help largely of the British and to a lesser extent Italians and other Europeans. Right now, Sisi is seen as a quote-unquote Jewish American puppet who is simply there to suppress Islamist elements and to keep everything quiet and prevent Egypt from joining the ranks of those Islamic nations and peoples who are opposed to Israel's grand strategy to build a greater Israel. Well, that costs us a lot of money. The only state that receives almost as much money as Israel on an annual basis, in fact, it may be a little bit more at this point, is Egypt. And that money is vital. It's the money that is used to pay for the armed forces. It's money that's used to pay for housing and offset medical costs, all sorts of things inside that country. So he's been very reluctant to take a strident position against the Israelis for fear that we'll pull the rug out from under him. I think he's beginning to understand that the Saudis, the Emirates, and others in the world will come to his aid, but he's still very afraid. In the meantime, the population in Egypt, how do I put this? I think they are at a boil, frankly. The hatred for Israel and what is being done to the people that live in Israel, in Gaza, on the West Bank, is just stunning. It's overwhelming. And I think he really faces the grim possibility that he could be removed from power, with all that being removed means. And then suddenly, overnight, Egypt becomes a hotbed of hostility. And the Israelis are not unaware of this. I mean, you're talking about an intelligence service that's very competent, and the Israelis have looked at many, many alternatives for what they ought to do in the event that Sisi is removed. One of those is a contingency to actually move into the Sinai and seize control of the Suez Canal. The problem for the Israelis is largely one of manpower and resources. So they may actually go back and ask for the British and the French to assist them in seizing control of the Suez. This is a very touchy area. We've been down this road before.
That would be a pretty big geopolitical earthquake. I mean, how likely do you think it would be? Or maybe a better question is, what conditions would have to change or devolve, maybe a better word, that would make the British willing to take that kind of action along with Israel in the Suez Canal? That would be a big issue.
Well, I think if you had a government come to power or people come to power in Egypt who are similar to HTS in Syria, what works in Syria for British and U.S. interests may not work for British and U.S. interests in Egypt. In fact, I'm one of these people I keep trying to convince anyone who will listen that Syria's destruction and disintegration really is not a good thing. And that ultimately this will redound to the disadvantage of the Israelis and us. And we're sending more troops into Syria right now, as you know, and ostensibly for the purpose of retaining control of the oil and everything else. I think that if Sisi suddenly is removed and you get a new government, new leadership, military or otherwise, people are going to be very afraid because they're worried about the Suez. They don't want the Suez in the hands of powers that are hostile to the West. And I think whatever government comes to power in Cairo after Sisi will be very hostile to us and to the Israelis. The Israelis then would be tempted to move in, but they would clearly want British and French help. This time, in contrast to Eisenhower in 1956 declined to support that, I think at this point in time, I'm sure President Trump would probably say that's fine if you want to do that. I don't think that's a good idea. And I think Israel is beyond overreaching. This is a headlong jump into the abyss, frankly. And the same conditions apply to Jordan. You've got to look at King Abdullah's position. He is very dependent on our largesse to keep his armed forces under control, to keep his officers paid. In all of these countries, it is our unnatural influence as a result of our willingness to spend money on things of no value or on things of no importance to us that has kept governments friendly to Israel. It's not working anymore, and it's going to vanish.
Well, and speaking of Israel and how they're maybe a bit overreached already, something in Egypt may not be the only thing they're thinking about doing. There's also some concern that before Trump gets inaugurated, so we're talking literally just 2+ weeks from now, there's a possibility by many that Israel may strike Iran. In fact, there's this piece here in the Hill, I guess about 4 to 5 days ago, advocating exactly that. This is not the only one I've seen. They say, listen, this sets the stage for Trump administration to go beyond maximum pressure and target the heart of the Iranian regime. We've seen Bolton, we've seen Pompeo, Jack Keane. All these folks are harshly advocating for action by the United States. What is your concern that from Netanyahu's perspective, given his knowledge about how militarily overstretched they may be right now, to actually make good on that?
Well, Jim Carden and I wrote a piece entitled America's Next War of Choice, Iran, and tried to essentially answer your question. So I would invite people to go to the American Conservative and find that article, because it's going to provide more detail than I can here right now. But let's consider the following. If you're Mr. Netanyahu, you're in a very dangerous position. What do? Do you withdraw? Do you retreat? Do you fall back? Do you seek to consolidate what you have and cut a deal? No, because that would be fatal for him politically inside Israel. So what he's got to do is he's got to do more of what he's already begun, and that is spread the war. You know, I call Israel essentially now an arsonist state. It's burning down everything in sight, burning down Gaza, burning down the West Bank, burning down Lebanon. They're going to burn down as much of Syria as possible. They've just launched the largest air campaign in years against Syria, destroying targets all over the place. They think that they're accomplishing something. What they're accomplishing is the destruction of a status quo that they may not have liked, but they're setting the stage for the emergence of something much, much worse. And that was always the objection that we had to destroying Syria. Whatever you didn't like about Mr. Assad, next to the people that were positioned to replace him, he looked like Santa Claus. And right now what you've got is a very dangerous group in Damascus. And by the way, they report to Mr. Erdogan. So effectively, the Turkish border has now been moved several hundred miles to the west to the Israeli border, wherever the Israelis are. And by the way, Mr. Erdogan has spoken very publicly and made his argument repeatedly that the Israelis cannot have any of the spoils of this war. In other words, he is not going to tolerate Israeli annexation of land. Now, that may not be possible immediately, because the Israelis may decide that come hell or high water, they're going to stay there and retain it. But this is not a good thing for Israel, because Israel thinks that by destroying Syria, they've opened the pathway to attack Iran without interruption or disruption. They may discover that Syria now is even less hospitable than it was before. And I know that the Turks are planning on bases in and around Damascus to include substantial air and missile defenses. None of that is going to be good for Israel, in my judgment. So I think he has to say, do I wait for President Trump to show up? Do I risk the possibility that President Trump looks at this disaster, finally realizes it's a catastrophe, and says, I don't want to play, I really want a deal? Even though the probability of him getting a quote unquote deal at this point in the region is pretty slim. My limited exposure to President Trump, and I like him, as you know, I feel great affection for him, this is not a man of war. This is not someone who wants war. I think Mr. Netanyahu knows that. So if you're Netanyahu, what do? I think you pull the trigger and get into it now. The same thing applies in Iran. I think he's worried that the Iranians will have nuclear warheads that can be mated with missiles very shortly, in which case Israel's monopoly on nuclear power ends very quickly. I don't think Mr. Netanyahu wants that to happen. So those two considerations drive me to the conclusion that Mr. Netanyahu has got to get the war started with Iran as soon as possible.
And if that happens, one of the big vulnerabilities to the United States is our troops in Syria, which we've been arguing should have been out long ago, 2019 at the latest, after the ISIS had lost their territorial acquisitions, but we've remained on there. Well, this recent, and the last thing I want to cover here, in this recent terrorist attack in New Orleans, where someone who had been radicalized, and a former American soldier had been radicalized in had ISIS flag and several other things. Predictably, there are those in the United States that want to seize on that as an opportunity to make sure we get our teeth deeper into Syria. Watch this.
When America fails to lead, when you don't engage in solid law enforcement and enforcing criminal laws, when you can't secure your borders, when you refuse to call out radical Islamic terrorism and punish it, you get the events of October 7th. You get the events of just this past week in New Orleans. You get a resurgence of ISIS. You get Al-Qaeda back growing again after what happened in Afghanistan. This is a set of failed policies that lead directly to increased risks all across America, in our cities and all across this country. I fear not only are there folks who are members of ISIS or inspired by ISIS, as we saw, but there are planners, there are plans, there are people who might well be activated. This is the task that President Trump and his team will face. They need to go find them all, take down these networks, do the solid intelligence collection, right? This is hard work, collecting chatter from abroad and things that are taking place inside the country. It is granular grunt work that's got to be done and executed by the federal officials, by local and state sheriffs and police forces, but it needs to be led by the United States of America from the top.
Now, in the setup to that commentary there by Pompeo, the Foxacre had literally connected everything that had been associated with ISIS over several years to what's going on here, and saying that, yeah, we've got to go after them. And you see Pompeo just trying to deepen that thought there. What would happen to the United States if we do deepen our hold in Syria? And what would happen if we take them out of Syria, as you advocated in Poland and elsewhere?
Well, keep in mind that Secretary Pompeo, when he was head of the CIA and later on as the Secretary of State, was very much in favor of supporting ISIS and its offsprings in terms of al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations that were descendants of al-Qaeda. He bankrolled that. He supported it in Syria. These are the people that have now taken over in Syria. So on one side of his mouth, he's saying that we should join the Israelis in an all-out war against Islam in the entire region. And at the same time, he's one of the arsonists who's helped to light the fires that have brought down not just a government in Syria, but have helped to create chaos across the Middle East. So one has to take, whatever he says with a grain of salt. Understand that he's very much a creature of the Israel lobby. He's a recipient of enormous quantities of money and donations for backing everything and anything that is what Mr. Netanyahu wants, war with Iran and so forth. Finally, there's no understanding of the consequences of our actions. What we've done in Syria, what is likely to happen in Egypt, and what will precipitate the war with Iran, that whatever the Israelis come up with, ultimately we're going to end up in a situation where millions of people are going to be harmed. There's going to be enormous damage done to us and as well as to Israel. Israel may not even survive this because the hatred is just overwhelming at this point. And we are then isolated from the rest of the world because the Russians and the Iranians now allegedly have a mutual defense pact in place.
Yeah,
and Russia is not going to stand by and watch us destroy Iran.
That is so ironic, if not outright perverse, that so many in the United States, especially who are supporters of Israel, think that by cheering them on in these military conquests, that they think this is going to accomplish something, that it will bring peace and security to Israel. But as you point out, and if we had more time, we could certainly go into it even more, it's almost certainly planting seeds of disunity and also of insecurity that they may not be able to handle later on. But we'll have to leave it right there for the time being. We'll certainly continue to follow that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doug. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.
And we'll just ask you guys to just watch, because here literally just minutes from now, we're going to have Aidan Minnis, who was a former British person who's working, fighting on the Russian side. He's going to talk about what's going on there. We've had people on the Ukraine side who have fought for the Ukrainians, who have been pro on that. We like to balance things out. We're going to hear from the other side. Join us real quick, 2 p.m. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.